Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. Today, we're joined by Mair for our program, New York State as a Leader in Environmental Protection. Mair joined the Adirondack Council as Forever Adirondacks Director in May 2021. He's an environmental justice pioneer who has worked over the last 40 years in the spaces of health, environment, climate change disparities, and wilderness protection. He is an urban environmental activist and a regional and national environmental justice organizer and strategist who has advised 2 presidents and Congress, served on the National Board of Directors of the Sierra Club as its 57th president, and as the New York State Atlantic Chapter chair. Tom Ruller has been New York State Archivist since 2015. Tom is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form, on which he has consulted with several state governments and other organizations. So now, without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Tom and Aaron.
Aaron, it's great to see you again, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. And what strikes me right at the very beginning is your background. It's sort of almost representative of the stories of the multiple stories of the Adirondacks. You've got John Brown's farm in the foreground, representing a story that really is part of a bigger story that is not very often told. Behind that is the Mount Van Hoevenberg ski jump, which is the story that everybody talks about. You know, the 1980 miracle on ice, you know, the climbing Mount Marcy and all the great things about the Adirondacks that people who enjoy the outdoors really appreciate, and the stories that the Adirondacks tell us. I think just maybe before we go too far, I think it's important for people who might not know what the Adirondacks are, just to sort of level set, you know, what's when we talk about the blue line and all of that, what are we talking about in terms of the Adirondack Park?
Well, the Adirondack Park is our nation's largest wilderness and park area. It has 500,000 acres of old growth forest, which is that virgin forest. It's been around even before the settlers. It's you know, when the Native Americans, we were sitting on unceded Mohawk lands. So if you want to get a sense of the lands, what New York and this country was like, and when, you know, First Nations ruled, you should, you know, arrange for, we don't want to have a lot of people going here because the old growth area is a fragile ecosystem, but you should, you know, make a point. And Tom, I encourage you, in fact, let me give you an invitation for you and I doing a tour of the old growth, so you can get a sense of what it was like when the first Europeans set foot upon this land. The carpet, and the ecosystem is just it takes your heart and your breath away. But the 6 million acres, like I said, you can fit most of our nation's largest, like Yosemite, Yellowstone, and quite a few others into this park and still have room to move. You can put the whole state of Vermont inside of the Adirondack. Again, just to give you a sense of scale. So it is a beautiful treasure, an experiment that was gifted to New Yorkers by our forward-thinking late 19th century leaders to have a forest preserved. And we were talking about the Adirondacks and the Catskills. And there were other parklands that were denoted by a green line. But for the forest preserve lands, the Adirondacks and the Catskills were actually in a blue line. So when they talk about the blue line, it is a legacy of a demarcation of that forest preserve as distinct from parklands within New York State. So it is a treasure that has a deep, rich history from the First Nations all the way to the fleeing First Nations, basically enslaved African Americans who have settled this. This is part of the American story. When you think about the American narrative, you know, you think about the Adirondack Park, and it's one of those places that right now you can enjoy the rich recreation, or you go on historiographical tours, or you go on any of the tours. And like you said, what's behind me from Mount Hoevenberg to John Brown's farm is just like in the ancient world. There's layering of history. And the great thing about this talk, we hopefully can talk about one of the fascinating strata or layers within that wonderful history that is inclusive of John Brown's farm behind me.
Well, let's talk about that strata of history. The Adirondacks, again, nowadays people talk about hiking and nature experiences and all of that, but to a large extent, the Adirondacks were an unknown area. I mean, they're still the virgin territory, or the virgin forests up there.
Mhm.
But in the middle of the 19th century, the Adirondacks played a really, really important role in our state's history, and a story and a role that isn't often told. And it involves players like John Brown, like Garrett Smith, and many others. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in the Adirondacks in that story that we don't hear about? We only hear about the trees and Bob Marshall and the 1932 Olympics. Tell us the rest of the story.
Correct. And those are all, again, very important layers and strata within the history. So, there's no one piece of our history or the American narrative that's important than the other. We think about a long thread that is woven into a cloth that makes us uniquely and distinctly New York. And so you're dealing with the earlier part of that thread of history that really begins with the founding of this nation. Many people don't realize during this so-called American Revolutionary War, when America was breaking away from the crown, that there were free men of color within the various continental and militia regiments. Now, oftentimes when that history is told, because it's not written in the voice of people of color, and more importantly, the first citizens at the success and conclusion of that war were those who fought and served. And they got special allotments of lands. They got land bounties. They got pensions. They were able to build that first level of wealth. And those Americans became the founding pillars of our great American society. They were the early millionaires. They were that intergenerational wealth was able to accrue to them. But not so for the Black patriots. And there was actually, not too many people realize that there was one continental regiment. Almost 50% of it were African Americans. They called it the Black Regiment, which was the first Rhode Island regiment. So that was a continental line regiment authorized by the Continental Congress. And you have scant mention of it in American history books. And New York State, by the way, plays very, very significant and prominent in that legacy as well. And that perhaps that's another discussion, Tom, that you can invite me back to talk about. But going back to that Revolutionary War, one of the things that came out of it was the valor of these soldiers and these vets. And that memory from these first citizens who would become state legislators, governors, congressmen, senators from the New England area. You would then understand why this became the bulwark of the abolitionist movement, because here were people who were brothers and sisters in arms with these people of color who fought for the freedom and then realized the double deal when the U.S. settled on its constitution and then made these men and their families 3/5 of a human being. So you would still find that fight for the revolution continuing in New England. And New England, Maine, all the way down to Maine, Connecticut, Vermont, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, they would grant free people of color, and definitely those who served, the right of franchise. They were given that citizenship. They were given the right of franchise that they can vote. And the purpose of that franchise, that right to vote, was that you can absolutely fight against the injustices in the Constitution and push for better laws, right? So having representation was very, very critical. All did that except for New York. And New York, you had a series of conventions in which they were trying to fight for the right of suffrage, and then mainly suffrage then, and the right to vote. When we say the right to vote, was for males. It was split and stratified gender. Women did not get it until the 20th century. But when we're talking about suffrage in this context, it was the right for men to vote. And in this case, when it came to New York in 1846, after there were several clauses that gradually emancipated Black people. And then there were these grandfather clauses that if your father was a slave, you had to go through this, what they call it, like a program whereby you would work a traineeship, like, you would gradually get, your freedom. But the point being is it was through these mechanisms that they would put caveats that restricted the right of franchise. And, so there was an active effort to push back against slavery, the wrongness of slavery. It never, as I said, the revolution in the New England area, and including amongst those veterans in New York who had become the bulwark of the abolitionist movement, the fight for that freedom of universal equality, of all that Declaration of Independence, continued until the end of the Civil War. But that fight was very, very active in New York State, and that fight to make New York State comply and be part of the brother and sisterhood of New England and having the right of universal suffrage, inclusive of free people of color, to be realized, was a critical part. So one of the things you look in 1840s was not only was there active abolition and fighting against chattel slavery in the United States in that 3/5 clause, but there was an active resistance in New York, and the Adirondacks featured very favorably in that fight. In fact, when they were voting for the universal suffrage, it was the up north counties in the Adirondacks inclusive that actually voted for the universal suffrage. If you can think about the politics today, where you have some of the politicians, talking about replacement theory. So they're actually going the opposite way of the founders and early settlers of the Adirondack counties, who actually were for abolition, for equality, and for respect of all Americans. But, the thing is, what's really powerful is that in the 1840s, you had, an ugly feature of that, which was, the tools to maintain the social order, which were these fugitive slave acts, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793 and 1850, whereby people of color were pretty much, bopped over the head, put in shackles, and then taken to the South. Now, many people then, when somebody was arrested and seized, people did not run up and interview the slave catchers and say, hey, did that person get habeas corpus, due process rights? No, they just figured that if you are in shackles, you must have done something. And the white person who has you incarcerated or is seized, they were within some due right. So there was always this deference and not really inquiry as to who was being taken and how they were taken. But thousands of free people of color in New York, and the whole area, were being seized and taken. And so much so, we have a very active abolitionist movement. You have the African Methodist Episcopalian churches being part of these networks. And you have these networks that brought in, again, the white allies, the Garrett Smiths of the world, who were very critical insofar as saying, we got to change this and we have to have radical ways of changing this. And the radical way was just basically organizing and pushing and mobilizing for the right to vote. So in 1846, when this effort came up, one of the hooks that they were putting into this was the need for one to own land. And there was that land requirement and land and money requirement. So it's sort of like a poll tax and a property tax. You had to have these two things. But poor whites got the right to vote regardless, but for blacks, for them to have the right to vote. And if you can put up that slide.
Yeah. For blacks to have that right to vote, they had to own land. And again, going back to the issue of, again, why was this an imperative and why was this very critical? Why was this the center of people's being? Well, one of the things that happened, I think that many people have heard of the tale of Solomon Northup, 12 Years a Slave. And if you haven't seen it, I would say when listening to this presentation today, go back and watch it again. But he was quintessential, what I call a typical person, free person of color. And in particular, Solomon Northup was born in Minerva, New York. And again, this is another piece of Adirondack history that is lost, even in that film and that telling and that representation of fact. Again, these narratives tend to capture the event, but they take them out of context. Again, the context of Solomon Northup, he was typical of any black in anywhere in New York of that day. And regardless of where he was born, and the fact that he was born free, and the fact that he was born in the Adirondacks, and that he was, he worked and he was very skilled. He was a skilled musician. He was a skilled boatsman. He worked on the Erie Canal. He earned considerable wealth. He had a beautiful, in fact, I believe his wife was Native American, and
again, very much apart, but he was taken and seized. He was, deceived and pulled in. But once he was seized and in shackles, he was beaten to not say he had another name. But even when he protested and demanded that he, have a right to go to a judge and prove his innocence, he was beaten and eventually taken down south. But he was symptomatic of the crises that every single free person of color in the United States, in the New England area, that was facing. And people don't realize, again, this was part of keeping the peace and keeping the North and South in the Union together. It was at the sacrifice of the liberty and freedom of free people of color. See, people tend to think of the abolitionist movement as only fighting for the enslaved. No, it was fighting for the universal freedom and condition of all African Americans. Because even when you are free, as Solomon Northup's case, Solomon Northup of Minerva, New York, of the Adirondacks, whose cases were proved, was that you could still be seized and taken into slavery, into bondage, and without anybody in New York civil society batting an eye. And so the cause and the urgency of getting the right to vote, to pass laws to protect Blacks, even from the egregious, malicious prosecution and denial of basic civil rights. This was a very, very, very big issue. And that movement really came to a head in 1846. And to that end, you had leaders like Gerrit Smith would step up with his wealth and his role within the abolitionist movement. Say, listen, if they got a land requirement, let me help purchase 3,000 tracts of land and offer them up for those free people of color to acquire them and meet the property requirements and therefore have the right to vote. So one of the great things about the Gerrit Smith purchase, as you see in this map here, is that those 3,000 parcels are distributed over a couple of counties, Essex and Franklin, and parts of Clinton. And they would form basically, I have listed 8, but there's actually 12 Black suffrage settlements. And why are they called Black suffrage settlements? I coined that term because that's what they were. People just tend to say that they were the purchase or free lands or the Gerrit Smith parcels. And again, this goes down to the scholarship and the interpretation of history of who's telling the story in history. If you strip it from the context of its historical purpose, then you tend to name it in the name of the white person. And again, this is white centering the history rather than people centering the history around why did it exist, what was its real purposes, and what was it a part of? And it was part of a movement of suffrage. And so me coining that term contextually places these settlements, these towns, and this activity in its proper historic context, rather than the person who, as I say, engineered the purchase. We don't get into naming various events in history, in names of certain individuals. We tend to look at them in process, like our Civil War. We talk about the various movements and trends within our civil society. We tend, even though we love great man theory, but this is one case when you get into a great man theory and make it a great white man, you lose the power and essence of the very special story that is in the Adirondacks, which is these Black suffrage settlements. And these settlements, again, had a particular purpose of guaranteeing the right of 3,000 Americans the right to vote. And what makes them special is that, they're located in the Adirondacks. Why the Adirondacks? Why the place where Solomon Northup came from? Well, the Adirondacks, think of it like a geological fortress, because as you know, the lower part is the high peaks, and the high peaks are like the walls of a citadel. They are a beautiful barrier against the fugitive slave bounty hunters, because if you want to try to get there, it's rugged, it's hard to get into, it's hard to get to. But more importantly, if you got 3,000 settlers up within it, it's hard to get out of. The ability to resist them, to protect, you're using the geology and geography to protect people, as well as the wilderness aspect. So they got to have trackers. So it's not an easy place to get into and get out, but it's one of those ways of saying it's kind of defensible. And we see this in 20th century revolutionary movements, whether it's Mao Zedong or our experiences in Vietnam, how a lot of the rebels tend to hide in the hills and the hinterlands. And that strategy is the poor man's strategy to protect and defend oneself, or poor people's strategy, or movement strategy, or resistance strategy. So this is pioneering in and of its day, the fact that here's land using the geography and location as part of a natural citadel to protect not only the right to vote, but to protect the people that are living there. And that's what makes this settlement very special. And he enlisted, people like, Willis Hodges of Brooklyn, who was a very, 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 very important revolutionary activist and radical. Hodges is one of those people who came from slavery, fled from slavery, would go on to create a radical press called the Ram. And he had been publishing, he had already been part of this settlement, and he's been part of this organizing efforts. And it's through his publication of the Ram that caught the eye of John Brown. And through Willis Hodges, his publication and his activism and the network of African-American Episcopal churches, this was very, very key. Think of the African-American Episcopal churches as way stations, as organizing points, but they were congregations of free people of color within New York State, which were the hub of the abolitionist activity and coordination throughout New York State. And so when you think of these churches, the leaders and folks, you see a very, very, very powerful infrastructure that would become the pipeline of people to these African Black suffrage settlements in the Adirondacks. And Willis Hodges, was one of those people. There's a deed book that's actually sitting in the New York State Archives for anybody who wants to go up and look up the people who acquired lands or who participated in the suffrage settlement. All of the subscribers to these lands are in the deed book. Did every one of them take a parcel? Yes. But did every one of them settle a parcel? No. While a number of people who out of necessity did, let's remember, there's only like 45, 46 days of planting season in the North Country. It is cold, it is freezing, it is inhospitable. And people will say, well, then why would they try to build these towns there? The answer is because they did not want to face down fugitive slave bounty hunters. And they want a place that, should they need to be there or have that place to retreat to, that strategic bug out center, meaning bug out in this military terms of saying where crisis comes at you, you got to leave fast. People like Hawley Green of Peekskill, New York. Hawley Green, if we can allow me to share my screen for a second.
I'm going to end my share.
Okay, and let me see how I do this. Do that, and can you see Hawley Green's wonderful home and parcel?
Yes.
Okay, good. So people like Hawley Green, who's in the deed book, because one of the myths, again, when we talk about how history is told, most people, because they only have fragments and they tell it centered from Garrett Smith, or they tell it centered from John Brown, you lose part of the actual bit players and actors who were not bit players or actors. These were people of means as well. So one of the things you find out about Hawley Green, in Peekskill, when I grew up, his house was just called the Underground Railroad House. And that's because it's all that they pretty much knew, the local history and the legend of the family, etc. And that's where it's up. But the context of where he fit within the Underground Railroad and how he was a player, that has been lost until my scholarship and recently my work until recently. Hawley Green, while a member, if you were to look at the deed book that's in the state archives, yeah, he would be portrayed as a person who got a parcel of land as part of the Garrett Smith settlements. And you would think that he was a poor Black, because again, a lot of that narrative, when they talk about people who got parcels, they were poor Blacks and former slaves. But what this shows you, that's not necessarily true. Hawley Green was a person of means. He was a barber. He actually owned several properties in Peekskill, New York, including that house that you see right there, which is an indication, if you think about it, mid 19th century, late 19th century, to have a parcel like that, it indicates he's a person that at least had savings, and he had, quite a few $1,000s, in parcel and properties, in the 1820s and 1830s. I was able to contact him as part of my research and work, and contact his family members. And in their own records, in the family's own records, one of the things that you see mentioned is, the right of franchise. So even in their own records, they talk about the right of franchise and the right to vote right there. And, and again, what they're missing is this other beautiful piece that he was actually part of something. He was part of the Black suffrage movement. And so here in their own family history records and archives that was shared to me by his family, we get a picture of Hawley and his wife, but also, and she too, again, like Solomon Northup, part Native American. But what's very powerful is that, they were here's in their own records that Black suffrage story is lifted up, and these records, that the State Archives has with these books. Again, if you look only at the property of Timbuktu, for example, which was one of the suffrage settlements, it wasn't the only one. Like I said, it was a dozen of them, and one of the settlements is Ray Brook, and Ray Brook went from being a suffrage settlement in its day to now one of incarceration. So when we talk about the ironies of history and how this is played out, we lose sight of the beautiful history that began these towns, and it begins to be defined in the career paths of how New York State has used prisons as a tool of economic development. And so that the exposure that whites in the North Country have with most people of color is that they are of the incarcerated class or caste. And so therefore, we have over 3 to 4 generations of New Yorkers coming up with careers in the correction industry services, whose main orientation to people of color is that of criminals, et cetera. And then again, how does that start to shape and interpret people's local values, given our rich, robust history, and that the current construct is a form of economic development to deal with, employment opportunities and poverty in the North Country for whites, but again, on the back of people of color. And again, how does that shape one's interpretations and views, and how does one value that? But again, to go back to our story, with regards to the Black suffrage settlements, again, people would say, well, listen, all right, you're saying that they exist, but what happened to them? Where are they now? Well, one of the things that happened, I always give the metaphor of Jackie Robinson and Major League Baseball. And to understand that, you have to, let me see if I can stop sharing. I'm trying to stop sharing.
Okay.
Let's see if I can get this thing going. Oh boy.
Yeah, I think that's one of the questions that I hope you'll talk about in a minute.
Yes, but anyway, let me jump to that question. I'm not sure, maybe our behind the scenes administrator person can probably help me stop sharing, so that I can at least have us, there we go. I knew somebody would be there to help save my poor technically challenged soul. But what happened? Well, the thing is that, the purpose of this was to secure the right to vote. 3,000 New Yorkers of color would have the right to vote from 12 townships within the state of New York. And again, that's not enough to shape and change the policy, but what it did do is make a dent and push New York further and really increase the power of the abolitionist movement within the state of New York. And just like with Major League Baseball, when ended the Civil War in 1865, when you had the 15th Amendment, which granted universal suffrage to all Americans, again, all male Americans, women were left out, Black women and white women were left out. We would not see that till 20th century. Then you did not have to have a strategic place to retreat to. You did not have to have a place to hide. So people like Hawley Green could then live in the splendor of his beautiful home in Westchester County, where they had a summer season and a planting season and the farms. So they did not have to migrate.
And he didn't need a place to bug out to.
And you did not need a place to bug out to. I always tell people, I says, you don't realize that in the late 19th century and early 20th century, they had something called Negro League Baseball. In every single urban center, especially Buffalo, Syracuse, Albany had the Albany Black Giants Stadium that was on Livingston Avenue, where Livingston Village Apartments now sit. There was a stadium there for the Albany Black Giants. And one of the legends of that was Edsel Walker, who would go on to play for the Homestead Grays. He would become a legend in baseball history and statistics. But again, when Jackie Robinson in the mid 20th century was able to cross the color line, and baseball, for anybody who's serious about being an owner, is about winning. It's about pennants. It's about World Series. And when this one guy helps the Brooklyn Dodgers to the World Series, it was like a weapons dash to sign up every single African-American that was in Negro League Baseball. And they were signed up by every single Major League Baseball team, which crippled and killed the league. And so what ended up happening within a couple of years after Jackie and all the black players go into the Major League Baseball, this league basically died. And this is that same metaphor, that same parallel is true with the Black Suffrage settlements. So once you have the full franchise and move into full society, the needs to protect yourself, all these things that you've engaged and you set up, they're not retained. People go in to be part of society. So they're able to move and live freely throughout the Union. And that's what happened. And so what happens is these properties, they're sheeted back to the counties for taxes or whatever have you. Some people were able to maintain or sell off the deeds, but many just look, it's no need to be there, and it's out of sight and out of mind. And again, this is what happened. But when we say, what are the remnants? Well, the John Brown farm that you see behind me, if you were to imagine, and if you were then to walk through, and by the way, John Brown farm is in the Plain of Abraham. Okay, it's part of the Timbuktu settlement. And the Timbuktu settlements moved from where you see the ski jumps behind me all the way into Lake Placid. Okay, and at that time in 1846, when you had Timbuktu, at that point in time in global history, there were only two places named Timbuktu. One in West Africa, which is the famed Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, because the Golden Empire, and the other in upstate New York in the Adirondacks, which is very powerful because it tells you about the fact that to name a settlement Timbuktu, how it meant and resonated, and then free people of color and the significance that they placed in history, heritage, and just saying, this is the emblematic. They didn't name it after some European city. They named it after a West African empire city who resisted, the Romans, who resisted, the Greeks, the Phoenicians, etc. So that same citadel metaphor is really powerful. And the fact that John Brown, through Willis Hodges' work, was able to connect and actually want to mentor. John Brown was a mentee of these Black suffrage settlement and resistance leaders. He was not their leader. He was a mentee. He became part of this movement. And this movement inspired and shaped what would become his struggle to say, if we got this going on here, let's go on to radically trigger that in West Virginia. And it informed his raid on Harper's Ferry. He invited Willis Hodges, as well as a number of Frederick Douglass and a number of leaders, to be part of the Harper's Ferry raid. Willis Hodges would actually be a major supplier of resources to John Brown. He pretty much was the one who got those goods, all those things that were the guns, the other pieces, all of the equipment that allowed, the logistics equipment that allowed for John Brown to engage in that raid. Number one, a major financial benefactor was an African-American woman who made a fortune in San Francisco. She was a major financial backer, were a major source of money. So major sources of revenue were coming from people of color, but the logistics and material resources were transported through the Adirondacks by Willis Hodges to John Brown. And the reason why that happened, because there were not cops or customs inspectors to inspect the carts as this contraband cargo was being given to John Brown so that he could begin and go off on this raid. Again, the Adirondacks playing a very, very significant role in, as I say, what would lead up to the Harper's Ferry incident Now, the Harpers Ferry incident by no means, as a lot of people, when they mistell the story of the Civil War, that John Brown and Harpers Ferry triggered the Civil War. No, Civil War was triggered by the firing of the South on Fort Sumter. It was the belligerent military act of secession and an attack upon the Union Army at Fort Sumter. What John Brown was responsible for was centering our nation's attention upon the grievous injury and harm of the institution of slavery. He engaged in a violent uprising, which was typical of the time of that period, not making any excuses or apologies. But if anybody reads, the battles in Kansas and Missouri, you will realize that the South had actually engaged in much more bloodier resistance, or yet equally bloody resistance, as people like John Brown. But again, when it's people of color and whites and abolitionists working together, they tend to get a black mark in history or historiographers. There's a recent film that was put out on HBO, which again perpetuates that myth of John Brown as a madman, rather than a soul that was outraged and working in solidarity with Blacks for the liberation of Blacks against the tyranny and brutality of slavery. So again, who tells the history, who centers the history is really critical and key. And that's why it's, again, very important and special that New York State Archives is doing this series. So it lifts up that strata, and it allows us to really see what's in the soil of our legacy that we should be proud of, and that we need to recover, and that we need to get the historiography, the markers. And again, I can't say enough about that. I am just honored to be here and have this opportunity, Tom.
We are very honored just to have this story be told. You cite the documents that we have in the archives, and they are one of the things that I say a lot is archival records provide access to the truth. Mm-hmm. They provide access to all the layers of history so that we don't forget all those layers and what really makes up the true soil of what our story really is. Mm-hmm. And it's people like you, Aaron, who mine those resources to help everyone have greater access to the whole story, not just one small piece of it. Can we talk a little bit about people coming up to the Adirondacks? Yes, there are the people like me who like to take a hike, who have, as an aspiring 46er, I'm not going to tell you how far I have to go, but there's a lot more to the story in the Adirondacks. So like Route 73 is probably about 3 miles behind where you are, or where your photo is. Mm-hmm. Getting into Timbuktu or those other settlements required roads.
Exactly.
Are those legacies of those settlements? Are those sort of some of the few vestiges?
Absolutely. The main roads, remember, these settlements cut the first and primary roads into the Adirondacks that people take for granted to this day.
Right.
And again, this is that unsung history. But even during the Revolutionary War, the post roads, Albany post roads, these were enslaved people that cut the post roads of the state of. So when you're going up down Albany Post Road or any of the old arterials, some were Native American paths that were eventually become, but a lot of the constructed roads were done by free people of color. But that is also true in the case of Timbuktu and the Suffrage settlements. The main roads, the arterials, are cutting that virgin forest and opening it up for the communities to be connected, and the movement of goods and services, through the wilderness to the various points that they need to, but also being a critical portal for the Underground Railroad. So a lot of these roads and that infrastructure that you're riding on, when you're going from John Brown's farm or Lake or the Mount Van Hoevenberg up to Lake Placid, where you go to see the Olympics, you're on roads that were pretty much cut by free people of color. And where the ski jumps are behind me, those were once farms and settlements. And so, while the forest has reclaimed that, and modern development like the Olympic infrastructure has reclaimed it for the modern strata, but be mindful beneath that strata. Be mindful when you're in Lake Placid and you're looking behind me and you see imagine that scape being little dotted with homesteads like you see behind me, like John Brown's farm. Mm-hmm. Again, history is not about what is current, but it's upon the layers upon which we built and retell news stories. And so people went on to tell the news stories of the 1930s Olympians, the 1980s story of the Miracle on Ice. All that gets told on top of a rich foundation of history that actually goes right to what is fundamental about being American: a right to vote, freedom, the struggle of humanity to be equal and free, and to live in harmony with the land, and to be part of this great civil society and experiment. This is not critical race theory. Like some people pejoratively like to forget about the ugliness of this time. It is American history. There's no such thing as critical race theory. It is the absurdity of current modern politics, who again hide the pain and harm that the oppressor inflicted upon the oppressed, and wants to hide that memory away from current generations. The answer of history is my friends and brothers and sisters with the Holocaust Memorial, is to never forget, so that there can be a never again. And no, do not look away. Do not look away. Bear witness, listen, hearken. And again, it is opportunities like this that we lift up the stories, and we refuse. What's beautiful about New York is refusing to hide that truth. 10 New Yorkers, 10 Americans in Buffalo, New York, were assassinated by a white American New Yorker, young male, who was hyped up on a theory that he's being replaced by blacks. Let's be clear about this. First Nations and First Nations were here in spite of and because of white Americans. And the First Nations, whether it was slavery, brutality, racism, segregation, we are born the bloody brunt of that brutality, and that exists to this day. And it is the retelling of a lie. The real great lie is that we're trying to replace somebody that let this young man warped his mind to go out and take action and kill 10 New Yorkers. And if they have this history, it's not critical, but this truth, then he would have probably been an entirely different individual. He would have probably wanted to be an abolitionist. But when somebody told him in his young mind, whose frontal lobe is not fully developed, that he's under threat and under attack and he must take action, this is why, all the more reasons why we must take stewardship of this history and tell it right. Don't look away. Don't be afraid of the pain of the past. It just reminds us of our obligations to all citizens in our great civil society.
Wow. I almost think we need to stop right there. Because that was said so perfectly. Thank you for that.
Thank you, Tom.
Just a couple of quick basic things. John Brown's farm is open. It's a historic site. People can come and visit, and they can learn this story. They can learn a little bit about Timbuktu. They can learn the full story of John Brown, which isn't just about Harper's Ferry. It's about a lot more.
He's a father. He was a father, a husband,
yes,
a farmer, a patriot,
yep,
a lover of humanity, and
a mentee. A mentee of some incredibly smart, effective.
A mentee of African Americans, a mentee of freedom-loving blacks who had fellowship with the universal fellowship, the universal man. He indeed was a imperfect student, but a perfect student for the day in his time.
So I hope that people that hear this realize going to the Adirondacks is a lot more than hiking in the woods. It's a lot more than paddling down a stream. It is really understanding and appreciating the people that enabled us to get there, that settled this land, whose legacy really lives on, but can only live on fully with us getting a better understanding of who was there, what they did, and what they've left behind for all of us to help build that layer.
Absolutely.
So that we can look not just at the surface, we can look much deeper. And you've really helped us do that today.
Well, we at the Adirondack Council take pride in not only protecting our nation's oldest and largest wilderness area, but we created something that we call learning journeys. And a learning journey is where we go out to not only teach the appreciation of the flora and fauna and the uniqueness of this ecosystem, as we try to right now fight climate change, which this ecosystem is a critical part of that battle. But we created these learning journeys so that we connect all Americans and New Yorkers to their history and why this park is for all of us, intersects all of us, but a critical piece, a critical gemstone in our democracy and in our great civil society, but more importantly, in our very unique American New York story.
Perfect. Thank you. AdirondackCouncil.org, right?
AdirondackCouncil.org. And you can read more about my campaign, the Forever Adirondacks campaign, within that site. So when you're in the Adirondacks Council, you can read about the wonderful work and programs that we're doing to protect this fabulous ecosystem. And also encourage you to support us, encourage you to join a lot of our efforts, encourage a lot of our legislators and our governors to keep up the love, to expand. We got 30 by 30, which is protecting 30% of American wilderness by 2030. So we talk about that need for a strong, robust environmental bond act so we can get that additional 1.8 million acres, and to really realize, as part of a carbon sink to protect the climate, to get the full Bob Marshall. So thank you, and please. I got to get that in there, but thank you, Tom, for allowing me that commercial.